This tutorial presents an overview of the CropWaterSched analysis, which is part of the WaterSched Pro suite of decision support tools for irrigation. CropWaterSched is an irrigation scheduling tool which estimates your current soil water deficit in both the full soil profile and also the crop root zone, and provides a future prediction of when soil water will be critical and when you might need to irrigate. To demonstrate this, I'm going to set up a new analysis in CropWaterSched. To go into the Tools menu and click on the CropWaterSched menu item. Now this presents a menu with three different options on. The first is to review all analyses, and you can look at all your past analyses in tabular form or as mini reports. The third option here is to compile a PDF report, which allows you to select certain analyses and generate a booklet that you can print or send to someone. But we're going to use option 2, which is create new analysis. Now straight away we've got an analysis appearing in front of us with pre-populated inputs. It's gone and run a simulation and it's generated a series of outputs for us. Okay, and the reason it does this is it will use the last analysis that we've ran as a default, and will copy those values into the new analysis, which is pretty handy when you're running cropping for a new year. You can go to the previous year's crop and all those settings will be carried over. Now it calculates the soil water deficit by using a daily water balance model, which treats the soil layers as a series of dipping buckets. And what it does is that for each day of the simulation we take our data, our rainfall and evaporation and temperature data from the Bureau of Meteorology, and we model tipping water into those buckets, which is our irrigation and our rainfall, and we estimate losses, or what comes out and what's stored. So losses include transpiration, evaporation, drainage and runoff. We also calculate a yield in the model, which is presented as a summary here. We actually tell it what the yield is going to be, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. But we reduce that yield by the amount of stress or water stress that the crop experiences over the season. Now I'll just go over the components of the analysis. It's actually split up into 4 sections. So this top section here represents our inputs, and that's grouped into 3 different types of inputs, including site information, water balance and crop inputs. We then have some summary information of our key outputs, and we have a range of charts, including this soil water deficit chart, which is our main chart. We have a rainfall, irrigation and runoff chart, and a crop water use chart. And then we have a series of summary tables. This is our overall water balance and yield performance. We have a gross margin summary if we are connected to the Ag Margins website. So Queensland Government also has a gross margin calculator called Ag Margins that we can link in. We can send in our amount of irrigation and crop yield into there, and it will return back a report on gross margin. We also have water productivity table, which only appears when we are looking at a past crop or when the crop is completed. You'll notice here that we have a lot of NAs in this table. That just means that we haven't provided all the information that it needs at this stage. We haven't actually run any irrigations and we haven't calculated any gross margins. So if I go back to the top of the screen now, I'll briefly talk about the inputs that we have here, and then I'll describe this soil water deficit chart in more detail, and I'll change a few of these inputs to see how that changes the outputs on the soil water deficit chart. So under our site information are included inputs that represent our farm and field. Now there is another tutorial on setting up farms and fields in CropWaterSched and CropWaterUse. You can access the data by clicking on those buttons. For a farm, this links in our climate station, our Bureau of Meteorology data. The field button then has a menu that links in our field size, which is used when we calculate our gross margin, because the results are returned back on a per hectare basis. We can calculate the total gross margin. This links our soil type, and also field measurements that include local rainfall data that will actually override the Bureau's data, soil water sensor data that we can use to reset our soil moisture levels, and also irrigation records so that we can actually apply irrigation inputs to the simulation. Now just note that all of this information under this field is linked to any other analyses that are included in that field. So we can see on the left hand side here in our navigation bar for our farm and our top paddock, which is our current paddock, we've got 4 analyses. So all of these analyses are linked to that soil, that rain gauge and that irrigation data, so it's shared between those 4 analyses. Let me hit cancel. If we are partway through a season, we will get a prediction of what's going to happen in the upcoming months, and that's based on historical data. So there's 2 options here that help us generate our future prediction. This particular example we're looking at is 100% of the way through the season. It was planted, it's a past season in 2016, but if we were in the current season, we could use this information to generate what we call future plumes. Now the way it's done that is it'll run each year in our historical data set. It'll use that climate data and calculate soil moisture based on the conditions that we have today, for the current conditions today. So it'll seed each of those runs with today's conditions. We can do that for every year of data, or we can just pick out or cherry pick certain climate types such as El Nino years, La Nina years, or neutral years. Okay. We've also got a duplicate of our rain gauge information here. This was the same information that was linked in from our field dialog. It's just here to make it a little bit easier to get at. Likewise, in our water balance panel, we've got our irrigation menu as well, which that was also duplicated in the field dialog. In our water balance inputs, the first 2 are very important. This is how we seed our simulation. So we can start our season at a date before our planting date, and this gives us a fallow period, and we can also apply irrigations in that fallow period as well, so we can pre-irrigate our crop. The way that it works is we have an initial deficit, which I'll go and explain shortly how that works, and that's our starting point for doing our water balance. We also have some irrigation information. We just talked about this one. We have a refill deficit amount, which is not actually used in the calculations because we're not predicting irrigation, but it is used on the graph. It's actually this line on the graph, which I'll explain shortly. We also define minimum losses, so for furrow irrigation your losses might be quite high to runoff and evaporation. It's a minimum losses because the model may add some extra amounts to that, especially if you get rainfall occurring during an irrigation, or you get deep drainage happening. The last lot of inputs here is about the cropping, and we do have a range of crops in here. If you click on the crop button, this pops up a menu. I can see my 2 crops that I've been running, and it actually tells me the number of analyses that I've used those crops in. We do have a library of crops here. If I go create new crop, there's 11 different crops that we've set up. These are templates, so they have default values. When you click on one of these, it will create the new crop, and then we can edit the values. Now, I don't recommend that you go changing these values unless you know what you're doing. The exception to this might be the expected yield. So if you experience yields typically higher or lower than this, I would enter that value in and hit save. We also have our planting date listed here, which I'll explain how that shows on the chart. There's a couple of calibration factors here. Now this allows us to either increase our water use or crop water use, or decrease it, or increase our growth rate or reduce our growth rate. If you're finding that the template data isn't replicating what you're seeing in the field. And this is why it's a good idea to go and run, or to go and put a few past seasons data in here, so that you can play with these values to calibrate so that the model is predicting what you experienced. The last variable here is the stubble cover. So this is the amount, or the percent area of stubble cover that you experience on the ground, and this affects your evaporation rate. So the next thing in this tutorial is I'll just explain in a bit more detail about the main chart output, which is the soil water deficit chart. You'll notice that all of the charts here are time series charts, that they have a date on the x-axis. In this particular case, on the y-axis here, we're representing the soil water deficit. So this represents the field capacity of the soil, or the full water capacity of the soil. The bottom value here represents the wilting point of the soil, and the difference between those two is the plant available water content of the soil. Now that's at about 335 millimeters, and I know that because if I go up and have a look at my soil, I'm on a deep heavy clay with a plant available water capacity of 335 millimeters. So that is what that range is there. Now the two key outputs on this chart are this brown line and this blue line. So what do they represent? The brown line is the soil water deficit of the entire soil profile. That includes all layers. The blue line represents the soil water deficit in our root zone of our crop. So what you'll notice here is the blue line is zero all through this first month, and that's because we have a month of fallow that we've defined here, and we don't have the crop growing at this stage, so there's no roots. So we'll always have, while the crop's not growing, that soil water deficit in the root zone will always be zero. As the crop starts growing on the 1st of September, you can see our planting date to 1st of September, we have an initial jump down which represents the soil water deficit in the zone of the depth of where we've seeded that, we've put our seed. So there is an initial jump down on planting day. So we have this coloured band in here, this brown orangey coloured band, and that represents the stress region that we need to monitor. And if our blue line falls within that stressed region, that means our plants are getting stressed. Now you notice that this stressed region increases with time, and it's increasing with the root depth of that crop. So as the roots grow, that region, well, that deficit region will increase. So it's not actually the depth of the roots, it's the soil water capacity within that rooting zone. Now we can see that this line crosses over at this point here, so we can assume that our crop is getting stressed here, that there's not enough soil moisture available for it to grow satisfactorily. Now this is replicated below in our crop water use chart, or our ETC chart, where we have two lines, or two coloured plumes. The top envelope of all of these plumes represents the potential ETC. That's the potential crop water use, but because our soil water deficit is increasing to a point where the plant's stressed, we have a reduction in our crop water use, and that's represented by that lower green line. So the orangey brown coloured band in here, this is the stressed region, or the reduction in crop water use based on crop stress, and that corresponds to where this blue line crosses over into the stress zone. Now just going back to some of these inputs, so we actually started here with an initial soil moisture deficit of 0 millimeters. If we change this to 100 millimeters, you'll notice this brown line jumps down to the 100 millimeter mark. There is something happening on the day, there might be some rainfall on that initial day. By the end of the day, it's going to be around about that 100 mils. You notice the blue line doesn't change because we don't have any roots growing here. Okay. At the moment we don't have any irrigations. If we need to add some irrigations, we click on the irrigation button, and I'm going to add an irrigation in around this 16th of August mark. It'll be a pre-irrigation. So I'm going to set a date of 16th of August 2016, and I'm going to put on 50 millimeters of moisture at this time. So I click the plus button. That's now added in an irrigation. When I hit save, you'll see it appear on the chart as a dot, and we get this increase in soil moisture. Now that's not a 50 millimeter jump. We applied 50 millimeters, but it certainly didn't increase our soil moisture by this amount. That's because we've set a loss factor here. So if you go down to the key outputs table, you can see that we put 50 millimeters on, but only 23 millimeters has been effective, and that we've had 28 millimeters of losses. So if you had a more efficient system, you could reduce your losses and you'd see a greater increase in the soil moisture, or reduction in soil moisture deficit. If you are using this in real time and monitoring this blue line, you might want to add an irrigation in around about when this either reaches your refill deficit mark or gets into that stressed zone, and that blue line goes in there. So just for an example, I'm going to add an irrigation in on the 16th of October. So I'll go back to my irrigations menu, I'll go back to 16th of October, 2016, and I'm going to add 100 millimeters in here. I'll save, and you'll notice that we have an irrigation now occurring in there. Now finally, because this is a past irrigation, you should know what your yield was, your final yield was. So it's recommended that you come in and assign your final yield. So for this crop here, I 1.6 tonnes per hectare, and you'll see that's been updated in our final results, and it says measured on there. We can also calculate gross margin by clicking on this gross margins dialog here. So this links us into the Queensland Government Ag Margins website. It will pass in our yield and our amount of irrigation into that website. So I'll click this link. It finds a template for our crop, which is mung bean. You can actually view this in Ag Margins. I'll open this up in a new window. So this is our mung bean template. You can see it's passed in our yield of 1.6. You can actually edit this by clicking on the pencil icon here, and you can go and customize the information for your farm. There's a 4-step process in doing that as well. So it's split up into commodities, variable costs, and finally review your report and hit save. That will always keep updating back in WaterSched Professional. So I'll close this dialog. Now, as I mentioned before, when you create a new analysis, it copies the details from the previous one. So let's assume that this was accurate of my previous crop, last year's crop, and I want to set it up for this year's crop. I create a new analysis, and it will copy the main parameters across. You see it looks almost the same. We don't have gross margins linked, but now everything's there for me to change it and set it up for the new year. So the first thing I'm going to do is change our planting date to mid-October 2017. So I'll put this on the 15th of October. Now you'll notice that there's a great big long run here because we haven't changed our initialisation date, and I'm going to change that to the 1st of September 2017. Now there is an extra bit on the chart now, and this is our future prediction, and that's based on runs from a number of years. If you put your cursor over, you'll see that it does mention a year, in this case 1965. So we can change the range of data there back from 1900, or we can do it on just the most recent years. You'll get less dots in there, less runs. The little dots on the end here, they represent the harvest date. So you can see that we've got a range of harvest date. The crop is grown through growing degree days, so temperature plays a big impact on this, and you'll get a variation in when you actually harvest. The solid blue line here is the prediction of our soil moisture. So in practice, what we'd do, if we're running this in real time, we'd be monitoring this blue line. When we go below our refill deficit that we've nominated, and typically you'd align it with the top of that band, then we could estimate when we'd need to have an irrigation. So we can see here that it's stressed all the way through. In the other charts, we've also got a bit of extra data. It's showing the historical the historical rainfall and runoff events, and also historical crop water use events as well. So that completes our overview, our mini tutorial of CropWaterSched. Please check out our other videos in the series on how to set up a farm and field, and how to use crop water use. Thank you.